Sometimes a man stands up during supper and walks outdoors and keeps walking because of a church that stands somewhere in the east. And his children say a blessing on him as if he were dead. And another man who remains inside his own house, stays there, inside the dishes and in the glasses, so that his children have to go far out into the world toward that same church, which he forgot. This is a passage from Rilke, and I want to reflect on it a bit today. Welcome to my podcast, to Hints and Guesses, and to an ongoing series that I've started, which I've titled Eat This Scroll, which is an allusion to the strange visionary prophet Ezekiel, where he eats the scroll of the divine and it tastes sweet. And that's a little of what I'm hoping these short meditations will invite us into, which is just to consume, like the Eucharist, these little passages or poems or prayers. And I'm choosing ones that have particular resonance for me and have worked me in some way and turned my life inside out and revealed something I sometimes didn't even know was there, sort of hidden, like just beneath the surface. And the first time I heard this little poem, it sort of struck me, right to the core, really. I know that feeling of walking outdoors and of, moving toward something yet unknown, a kind of calling, a kind of pull, a kind of hunger, a kind of longing for the sacred somewhere in the East. I guess in some sense, I followed this kind of beckoning in a more literal sense, moving all the way to Jerusalem. What was I longing for? I was longing for that church, so to speak, that I'd forgotten, that we'd forgotten, that our fathers had forgotten, and at least that was the sense. And that kind of like walking out costs us something. I suppose it costs us something to stay, and it costs us something to go. And so I don't know. I just want to spend a few minutes turning this little passage around a few times. And maybe the first thing I want to say is just a few comments on the East here and what I hear. And of course, this is a podcast called Hints and Guesses, so you might hear something quite different. But what I hear in the image and in the symbol of the East is something of the whole, or the divine, or the mystery, or the sacred. It's the place in which we stand in relationship to the mysteries. And if you think about modern, contemporary Western life, there aren't many places which we could call holy ground, or the kind of ground in which we can stand in relationship to the mysteries. It's like, no, we want to strip everything down to its materialistic components and its economic value. Even spirituality's become like a $1 billion industry, or I made that number up, but who knows, something like that. And where's the church? Where's the place where we learn how to kneel? That's an allusion to T.S. Eliot. To kneel where prayer has been valid. Yeah, where is that place? And in the fragmentation of big systems like religious systems and churches and and really, historical frames of meaning are fractured and splintered, and we can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And so for many of us, this kind of longing awakens. That's what I'm hearing in I don't know, in this image of the East. And and it costs us something. And it's like Jesus saying, he has that haunting line, anyone who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is not fit for the kingdom. And Jesus says a lot of paradoxical things, and this is one of many, and when you put it alongside of his other teachings. But it's like that hesitation, that resistance, sort of like Lot's wife who looks back at the city in longing and turns to salt. And that's what can happen to us on the heart level, on the soul level. And I know, so there's something to be said, and the terrible cost that Rilke is pointing out here has to do with children. And there, you can read this quite literally, or you can read it a little more metaphorically, and maybe both are. It's not an either or, I suppose. And your own kids can, cross themselves or whatever, and say a blessing, and as if you're gone, because in some ways you've left the world of social, economic identity. So, maybe just a couple of other things, and I think that I'm hearing, and I think when I first read this poem, like most things, if you're honest, the ego or the dualistic mind, and I don't even think that's a negative thing. I think that's a kind of gift too, but tends to divide things always up into the good and the bad here. And you can read this as the good is the one who leaves and goes east, and I don't think it's that straightforward. And you could easily say that staying inside the dishes and glasses has its own power, has its own capacity to work, and sends our kids off on their own journey. So, just in the spirit of trying to hear, two sides of this paradoxical dilemma, I think we can hold them like that. Maybe there's a moment for going east and a moment for remaining inside our own house, or maybe we have to remain in our own house and inside the dishes and glasses until the current of our life kicks us out. Maybe it's not so much a matter of even will, but of, the mystery, like in the Jonah story, throwing us into the ocean when the time is right. And I'm thinking now of this line about the children here, and they have to go out, far into the world. And I certainly resonate with that, toward that same church which our fathers forgotten. It's like, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. Or it reminds me of Jung's haunting line about parenting: the greatest burden a child bears is the unlived life of the parent. And so when we're not living our life connected to the deeper thread here, or to the myth or mystery of our own life, our own mythos, and our own ultimate way of living and being in the world, something goes wrong, and it spills out into our families and to the family systems, and our unlived life we burden on our own children, and until eventually they say enough and they leave. What have our fathers and forefathers neglected here? And I'm sticking with the masculine here because that's the language that Rilke's using here. Of course, it's a translation, but so I don't know what the German alludes to, but, I think on one level he's talking about just being a human being, but on another level there might be some mystery to kind of the masculine archetypal mode of change. So I'm just keeping it there. There might be some feminine mysteries hidden in another poem that is about change, but of a different color or different vibe. So, and I think one of the main points that Rilke is alluding to is just the modern spiritual poverty in which we live, and this age of breakdown and dismantling or dismembering even. And of course, all those words, those big words, have archetypal meaning and part of the patterns of the great patterns of change and even what we could even call an evolution of consciousness. I was thinking of I've been reading some Edward Edinger lately, and he talks kind of in great length in a book called Ego and Archetype about the fragmentation of religion and how the ways in which the great religious symbols at one time kind of held us together personally and collectively, and you could say for better or worse, but certainly gave us a kind of a frame in which to find our feet. And you could say almost without exception, those symbols have been shattered. And it's kind of like those pieces are floating out there now, and they're filled with energy. And I'll try to be brief here, but he says, oftentimes we have three possibilities in this kind of modern landscape. And the first is some of that energy, I'll just use some, psychological words, kind of returns back down to the ego, we could say. So, the great symbols and doctrines and patterns to which we were saying, hey, there's meaning, there's truth, are broken, and they come back down to the ego. And he says one thing they do is they bounce right off and they go back up to something else, like typically an ideology, a political position, right, left, being anti-woke or pro diversity, equity, and inclusion. These kinds of like binary, usually ideological and political positions, communism, capitalism, whatever it happens to be, but it's all that religious energy, the power there. It's like it reflects back off the ego and comes straight back up to an ideology, which you then cling to like a fundamentalist. I'm adding that phrase, but that's often how it is. And you cling to it with religious devotion. It's a pretty scary place to be, really. And just look around, how many political, social, ideological positions, flag waving, banners, marching in the streets are held with the same religious zealotry you would see, say in the Crusades or something. He says the next option is that it comes back down to the ego, and the ego feels totally alienated and isolated, like a meaningless fragment of chemicals, synapses, atoms, and molecules in a meaningless universe of the same. That's that kind of like existential, nihilistic alienation. And look around. Yeah, that happens. Maybe it's not always an either or, but you can feel that. Yeah, there is no meaning then. And he says the third and most rare possibility is that it kind of returns to the ego, but then in some way cracks it open, and you start going deeper, down toward, to use Jungian language, toward the self with a capital S, and toward the mysteries of my own existence, to the ego being simply a tiny little island on a vast ocean of the unconscious, and down deep within there is a kind of ordering, the image of God, we could say. And the self. You could even say the true self. And I don't want to get into a whole conversation about what does Jung mean by the self and where others use true self. There's some differences here, but I just mean no, the fragmentation here takes us on that deeper journey. And that's the pull, I think, that Rilke is pointing out. No, we leave for a church in the East, and it costs us something great. It costs us a place in the world, that's recognizable as important. And when we pursue, something more mysterious. And I don't know. So maybe you hear something in Edinger's possibilities here. And so I guess I want to end with a few questions, and then I'm going to read it one more time here. And I don't know. Here are questions that I'm asking, and they kind of don't have answers, I guess. But what have I forgotten? Are there still things in my current worldview that are insufficient? And the answer to that is, of course. I have false beliefs right now as I'm speaking. And I have ways of seeing the world that no longer work. And what have I forgotten? And what would it look like for me to orient my life toward that, toward the East here, and toward the sacred, and to walk toward that? That's what I call a religious orientation. That following that longing. And I think this is part of the great invitation of midlife, and I don't really mean that age-wise, but sort of like when your first house is, constructed well enough, and all of a sudden you realize the foundations are rotten in some way, and you got to move out. Yeah. So yeah, where is this seed of meaning, we could say, or these threads of connection, and that I've ignored or severed? And I don't think really East means going back to church. I mean, there's nothing wrong with going to a church. I went to church on Christmas Eve, and it was interesting, the hymns and the songs and the passages and prayers that I haven't heard in a really long time. There was something still evocative about kind of the way, what's the right way of saying it? It's sort of like a way of facing the world. It's oh yeah, there's a way of facing the world that is different and more ancient. That was my sense. And I don't know, what would it look like for me? We used to say always, you need a personal relationship with God when I was a kid, or with Jesus. But it is still something like that. And that's part of I think the pull to the East. And I don't need to conform anymore to how I should sound or what I should believe. But the great adventure is to find out my own way of lighting a lamp, or putting one foot in front of the other. And maybe the most important question I think coming up out of this is where am I really? And to fully accept that. If I'm at home, in the glasses and in the dishes, really be there. Really, really be there. Say, I resist the East, and inhabit that fully, and let it work you. And if you've left and put your hand to the plow, try not to look back. Just fully inhabit the place where you are, and trust that there's some kind of larger shaper at work here, a shaping hand at work here. And at least that's what I'm hearing. Here's the passage. Sometimes a man stands up during supper and walks outdoors and keeps walking because of a church that stands somewhere in the East. And his children say a blessing on him as if he were dead. And another man, who remains inside his own house, stays there, inside the dishes and in the glasses, so that his children have to go far out into the world toward that same church which he forgot.